When an avoidant refuses to panic, the world mistakes it for strength. But what you're witnessing is not calmness, it is a fortress built out of fear, a silence carefully engineered to avoid emotional exposure. While others crumble, they remain composed, distant, unreadable, and that distance feels powerful. But here's the truth most people never see. This refusal to react is not emotional mastery. It is a defense mechanism trained through years of suppressing vulnerability. They don't panic because panic would require feeling, and feeling would mean confronting the very emotions they've spent their life running from. So instead, they shut down. They go cold. They disappear inside a version of control that makes them feel untouchable. But understand this, emotional shutdown is not strength. It is survival mode disguised as confidence. And if you've ever stood in front of someone who looked unshaken while your heart was breaking, know this, their silence is not superiority. It is disconnection. And the moment you understand that, you stop chasing their calm and start reclaiming your power. The calm silence of an avoidant is not peace. It is emotional armor. Because what looks like serenity on the surface is often a carefully constructed shield designed to block vulnerability, exposure, and emotional risk. When an avoidant falls into silence, they are not entering a state of clarity or inner balance. They are retreating into a protective mode that keeps them safe from sensations they never learned to process. This silence is not soft or nurturing. It is rigid, strategic, and controlled. It is a psychological wall, built brick by brick over years of emotional neglect, inconsistent affection, or environments where feelings were met with rejection or punishment. So instead of expressing pain, confusion, or longing, they learned that the safest response was to feel nothing, say nothing, and reveal nothing. To the outside world, this quietness can look admirable. People assume they are grounded, strong, unshaken by emotional chaos, but internally their nervous system is operating from fear, not calm. They equate emotional expression with danger. When tension arises, their mind instantly seeks distance, detachment, and suppression. The silence becomes a form of control, a way to keep the upper hand, a way to avoid being seen too deeply. It is armor, because it is worn to protect a wounded core that fears abandonment, criticism, and emotional entanglement. This type of silence creates a deceptive illusion. Partners often feel confused, questioning why emotional intensity is met with coldness, why vulnerability is answered with withdrawal, why connection is replaced by distance. The avoidant silence is not indifference, it is a survival response screaming quietly beneath the surface. They are not choosing peace, they are choosing protection. Their emotional world feels like a battlefield, and silence is their way of avoiding the explosion. Emotional armor hardens over time. Each unspoken feeling reinforces the belief that emotions are unsafe. Each avoided conversation strengthens the pattern of withdrawal. They become masters at appearing unaffected, while internally emotions remain frozen, unresolved, and trapped. This armor also prevents intimacy, because you cannot feel deeply without allowing the possibility of pain. So the avoidant trades emotional depth for perceived safety, connection for distance, vulnerability for isolation. What makes this even more powerful is how convincing it can be. Their stillness can make others feel unstable for expressing emotions. Their composed demeanor can make pain seem excessive, longing seem needy, love seem weak. But this calm is not healing energy, it is emotional paralysis. It is the absence of flow, the freezing of feeling, the disconnect from authentic human experience. And the tragedy of this armor is that it not only protects them from hurt, it also protects them from love. Love requires presence. Love requires emotional courage. Love demands openness, softness, and the willingness to be seen without shields. But when someone lives behind silence, they deny themselves the very connection they secretly crave. They become distant observers of their own emotional life, watching from behind layers of self-protection. To understand this is to recognize that their silence is not a weapon, but a wound. It is the language of someone who never learned that emotions could be safe, who internalized the belief that closeness equals danger, who learned that the only way to survive is to disappear emotionally while still remaining physically present. Their peace is artificial, their stillness is rehearsed, their calm is conditioned, and beneath it all lies a trembling vulnerability that has never been given permission to breathe or be heard fully and honestly. in the presence of another without fear of losing control or being exposed too deeply and too suddenly in a world that never taught them how to stay open and still feel safe inside their own heart and emotional reality, where silence feels like safety, but connection feels like chaos and exposure, and risk and uncertainty that they are still unprepared to face, even when the desire to be understood exists quietly beneath the surface, waiting to be acknowledged, without judgment or pressure or fear of breaking the very armor that has kept them surviving for so long in emotional solitude and guarded existence that feels familiar, yet painfully lonely and disconnected from what true emotional presence is meant to feel like within a relationship dynamic that requires trust and mutual vulnerability, without the constant instinct to retreat and hide behind a wall of controlled quietness and carefully maintain distance. The refusal to panic in an avoidant personality is often misunderstood as emotional maturity or superior self-control, when in reality it is a deeply ingrained survival response rooted in early emotional conditioning. From the outside, their unshaken demeanor during conflict, distance, or emotional tension can appear powerful, even admirable. But this apparent strength is not the result of healthy emotional regulation. It is the result of emotional suppression, a reflex developed to avoid the discomfort that comes with feeling too deeply. Their nervous system has learned that emotional intensity equals threat, and so it shuts down not because it is confident, but because it is overwhelmed. When an avoidant refuses to panic, they are not calmly processing the situation. They are dissociating from it. They have learned that engaging emotionally leads to exposure, and exposure leads to pain. So instead of allowing emotions to rise, be felt, and be communicated, they disconnect. This disconnection is not strength. It is avoidance in its purest form, a protective mechanism that says, if I feel nothing, I cannot be hurt. The problem is that this strategy does not eliminate pain. It only delays it, buries it, and stores it inside the body and mind in silent, unresolved layers. True emotional strength allows space for discomfort. It allows trembling, confusion, fear, and honesty. But the avoidant's refusal to panic comes from the belief that emotions must be controlled at all costs. Panic to them represents chaos, vulnerability, and loss of power. So they choose numbness over expression, distance over dialogue, composure over connection. This creates the illusion of strength while eroding emotional authenticity. This survival response often originates in environments where emotional expression was unsafe. Perhaps vulnerability was mocked, ignored, or punished. Perhaps showing fear resulted in rejection. Over time, the avoidant learned that the safest position was emotional neutrality. But neutrality isn't peace. It is disconnection, and this disconnection can become habitual, automatic, almost invisible even to themselves. The refusal to panic becomes a badge of pride, reinforcing a self-image of being strong, independent, or unbothered, yet internally the body remains tense, guarded, hypervigilant. The heart is not at ease, it is braced for impact. The mind is not calm, it is scanning for exit routes. This is not resilience. It is a constant low-grade state of self-protection that prevents true intimacy and emotional release. Those who engage with avoidance often feel unsettled by this behavior. They may feel their own emotions intensify in contrast, leading to imbalance and emotional confusion. The avoidant's refusal to panic can make others question their own emotional responses, labeling them as too intense or irrational, when in truth, the avoidant's lack of visible reaction is the abnormality, not the expression of emotion itself. Real strength is the ability to face discomfort without fleeing. It is the courage to remain present in emotional storms. The avoidant's refusal to panic bypasses this growth. It eliminates the opportunity for deeper understanding, healing, and connection. It keeps everything on the surface, controlled, distant, contained, while beneath unresolved emotion remain unprocessed, unheard, and quietly accumulating behind a wall of forced composure. That feels like power, but is actually fear dressed as emotional discipline and calculated. Stillness that prevents authentic engagement and real emotional resolution within moments that require courage, vulnerability, and human presence without the instinctive retreat into silence. And emotional isolation that continues to reinforce a cycle of disconnection and misunderstanding. Stillness can mask a storm of unprocessed fear and detachment, because what appears to be quiet composure is often the external face of a deeply unsettled internal world. An avoidant may look calm, centered, and unaffected, but beneath this surface lies a complex web of emotions that have never been given space to move freely. This stillness is not the absence of feeling. It is the freezing of it. It is the mind choosing numbness over vulnerability, the body choosing shutdown over emotional flow, a controlled pause that hides tension rather than releases it. Inside this silence, fear does not disappear. It collects. Every emotion that is denied, every moment of vulnerability that is suppressed, every connection that feels too close becomes another layer in a buildup of unresolved internal pressure. Instead of processing these feelings, the avoidant distances themselves, not just from others, but from their own emotional reality. They learn to intellectualize instead of feel, to observe instead of experience, to detach instead of engage. The stillness becomes familiar, and familiarity is mistaken for stability. This emotional distancing creates a sensation of safety, but it is an artificial safety built on avoidance. The avoidant does not feel peaceful, they feel controlled. Their calmness is rigid, not fluid. There is no softness in it, no openness, no gentle acceptance of emotional waves. It is a locked door, not a quiet room. And behind that door exists anxiety, confusion, longing, and fear that has no healthy outlet. The storm they carry is often invisible even to them. They may proudly identify as logical, rational, emotionally independent, when in reality they are disconnected from their emotional core. They have trained themselves to override emotional signals, treating them as threats rather than guidance. Over time, this creates inner fragmentation where the heart and mind operate separately, leaving them with a sensation of emptiness masked by self-control. Partners and loved ones often misinterpret this stillness as emotional distance or lack of care, which deepens the relational divide. But the avoidant is not empty. They are overwhelmed in a way they have no language to express. They do not feel less. They feel too much, too quickly, too intensely. And instead of navigating that intensity, they retreat behind a still exterior. This storm remains trapped, swirling quietly beneath layers of unresolved emotion. This internal conflict becomes exhausting. The body remains tense, the mind alert, the emotional center guarded. What presents as serenity is actually a constant state of self-monitoring and emotional surveillance. They are bracing, preparing, calculating, even in moments that appear neutral. Their stillness is not rest, it is restraint. Unprocessed fear also shapes their perception of intimacy. Closeness feels dangerous, not nurturing. Emotional depth feels suffocating, not bonding. So the avoidant chooses stillness to regain a sense of psychological control. This choice, however, comes at a cost. It prevents healing. It prevents emotional integration. It prevents the natural release that brings relief and connection. True emotional peace comes from movement, not suppression. It arises when emotions are acknowledged, named, and safely expressed. But the avoidant stillness disrupts this natural process, freezing them in a constant tug-of-war between the desire to connect and instinct to withdraw, between wanting to feel and fearing what the feelings might uncover, between needing closeness and protecting themselves from the vulnerability that intimacy requires, leaving them suspended in a quiet that looks calm to the world but feels like a silent storm echoing inside the depth of their guarded emotional landscape, where detachment becomes identity. Self-protection slowly replaces genuine emotional presence, create a void that remains unhealed and unspoken and silently influential. Over every connection and every moment that could have become a space for true emotional freedom and safety without fear of drowning in the very feelings they were never taught how to hold or trust or understand fully. Control becomes their comfort zone when vulnerability feels dangerous, because an avoidant learns early that emotional openness invites risk, judgment, or abandonment. Instead of trusting connection, they trust distance. Instead of surrendering to feeling, they grip tightly to structure, self-reliance, and emotional self-governance. Control becomes the illusion of safety, the sense that as long as they manage their emotions, manage the pace of intimacy, manage how much of themselves is seen, they can avoid being hurt. This need for control is not about dominance over others. It is about self-preservation in a world that once felt unpredictable and emotionally unsafe. For the avoidant, vulnerability represents exposure. It means allowing someone close enough to see imperfections, fears, emotional needs that they were conditioned to believe were weaknesses. So rather than risk that exposure, they retreat into regulation, logic, and emotional restraint. Control gives them a sense of boundaries that feel protective. It allows them to stay composed, even when their internal world is anything but calm. They feel safer commanding situations than flowing within them. This pattern emerges subtly. They may be the ones who dictate emotional pace, decide when closeness begins and ends, or subtly pull away when intimacy deepens. They feel empowered by emotional distance, feeling less dependent, less vulnerable, less exposed. But what is really happening is a quiet fear of losing autonomy, of being overwhelmed, of becoming emotionally entangled in something they cannot easily escape. Their comfort in control can make them appear strong, firm, and emotionally untouchable. But this untouchability comes at a high cost. It blocks genuine connection. Real relationships require a certain level of surrender, the willingness to be influenced, affected, and emotionally open. Control does the opposite. It keeps emotional doors half closed, limiting the depth and authenticity of intimacy. To the avoidant, control feels like calm. It feels like safety. It feels like self-mastery. But beneath this structure is a deep resistance to unpredictability, to emotional chaos, to the unknown terrain of genuine emotional connection. They regulate instead of relate. They manage instead of share. And this careful orchestration of emotional distance becomes their identity. Vulnerability to them feels like standing without armor in a storm. They associate it with weakness, dependency, and potential rejection. So they reject vulnerability before it can reject them. This leads to a self-sufficient persona that prides itself on emotional independence but quietly longs for deeper connection. Yet the fear of losing control overrides the desire to feel. This cycle becomes self-reinforcing. The more control they exercise, the more disconnected they feel. The more disconnected they feel, the harder they cling to control. This dynamic can leave partners feeling shut out, unable to reach the emotional core beneath the rigid walls of composure and distance. What feels like strength is actually restraint. What feels like power is actually avoidance. And the cruelest part is that the avoidant may not even realize this pattern is limiting their capacity for meaningful connection, emotional healing, and authentic presence. They become prisoners of their own emotional structure, guarding themselves so fiercely that the very thing they desire, safety through connection, remains just beyond reach, hidden behind layers of emotion. Discipline, intellectualization, and calculated distance that protects but also isolates, comforts but also restricts, stabilizes but also suffocates the natural flow of emotional life that requires openness, unpredictability, and the courage to be seen without armor or control guiding every emotional movement and decision in a way that feels secure yet deeply lonely and disconnected from the raw truth of human emotion. Experience where safety is not in control but in trusted vulnerability and mutual emotional presence that they have yet to allow themselves to fully experience or embrace or lean into without fear of losing the very structure that has kept them feeling protected for so long in their carefully constructed emotional order and guarded inner world that continues to define how they love and protect themselves. Without realizing the silent cost of that protection, true power begins when we understand the psychology behind emotional withdrawal, because clarity dissolves confusion and awareness replaces self-blame. When you recognize that emotional withdrawal is not random cruelty or emotional coldness, but a deeply rooted protective mechanism, everything shifts. You stop personalizing the distance. You stop interpreting silence as rejection alone. You begin to see the pattern for what it truly is, a system designed to protect a fragile inner world from perceived threat, intimacy, and emotional exposure. Understanding the psychology does not excuse harmful behavior, but it changes the emotional narrative. You realize that the avoidant is not operating from emotional neutrality, but from conditioning shaped by past experiences where closeness felt unsafe. Their withdrawal is not a sign of superiority or emotional strength. It is a signal of unresolved emotional fear. This insight is powerful because it moves you from reaction to awareness, from emotional chaos to grounded comprehension. True power lies in emotional discernment. It allows you to differentiate between someone who cannot show up and someone who chooses not to. It helps you understand that the avoidance distance is not about your worth, your value, or your desirability, but about their inability to remain emotionally present when vulnerability surfaces. This shift protects your self-esteem. It liberates you from emotional overinvestment. It empowers you to choose boundaries instead of chasing validation. When you understand the inner workings of emotional withdrawal, you stop trying to force intimacy where fear lives. You stop trying to extract emotional engagement from someone who equates closeness with danger. Instead, you begin to observe, not absorb. You respond, not react. You maintain your emotional center instead of losing yourself in their distance. This awareness also invites compassion without self-sacrifice. You can acknowledge the wounds behind the behavior without tolerating emotional neglect. You can see the pain without becoming responsible for healing it. This is emotional strength. This is clarity. This is power. Understanding the psychology behind withdrawal also reconnects you to your own emotional needs. You begin to ask better questions. Is this dynamic fulfilling? Is this connection balanced? Am I shrinking to accommodate someone's emotional limitation? And through this self-reflection, you reclaim your emotional authority, allowing you to choose relationships that meet your emotional capacity rather than deplete it. This is where real strength forms, not in controlling others, not in forcing emotional access, not in proving your worth to someone who cannot mirror it, but in knowing when to step back, when to hold space, and when to walk away with dignity. When clarity enters, the emotional fog lifts, the confusion fades, the illusion dissolves. Understanding emotional withdrawal also reveals something deeper about human behavior. It shows how pain shapes patterns, how fear disguises itself as independence, how emotional armor replaces emotional vulnerability. And in witnessing this truth, you grow. You become more emotionally intelligent, more selective, more grounded. This is not about changing the avoidant. It is about changing your relationship with the dynamic. It is about shifting from emotional entanglement to emotional clarity, from unconscious attachment to conscious choice, from desperate connection to empowered awareness. True power is the moment you understand and no longer chase what cannot meet you where you stand, and instead stand firmly in your truth with emotional knowledge that frees you from the illusion and strengthens your ability to hold space only for connections that reflect safety, clarity, and mutual emotional presence without the weight of misunderstanding controlling your perception or fragmenting your sense of emotional worth and stability within your own lived emotional reality and awareness without depending on someone else's capacity to validate your experience or define your sense of value or emotional presence in relationships that require depth and truth and authentic connectivity that honors emotional intelligence and clarity over confusion and silent emotion. Withdrawal that no longer holds power over your choices, perspective, or emotional direction and understanding. The silent world of the avoidant. You now see that what appears as calmness, composure, and emotional distance is often a carefully constructed defense against vulnerability, pain, and past emotional injuries. Their refusal to panic, their stillness, their need for control, and their withdrawal are not signs of strength, but reflections of unresolved emotional fear and deeply rooted survival patterns. And within this realization lies your clarity, the ability to shift from confusion to awareness, from personalization to understanding, from emotional chasing to emotional sovereignty. You recognize now that emotional silence is not peace and distance is not power. You see that armor is worn not to dominate, but to protect, not to harm, but to survive. And while empathy may arise for the avoidant, something far more important awakens within you, your own emotional intelligence. The knowledge that you are not responsible for fixing what was never yours to carry, and that your worth is not determined by another's fear of closeness. This awareness reshapes how you move forward. You no longer beg for emotional connection from someone who fears intimacy. You no longer interpret distance as your failure. Instead, you choose clarity, boundaries, and self-respect. You honor your emotional needs instead of shrinking to accommodate emotional unavailability. You evolve from emotional confusion into emotional strength. And this is where true healing begins, when you stop longing for the calm of someone who is silently struggling and start embracing the grounded power within yourself. When you choose emotional presence over emotional absence, when you step out of their guarded silence and into your own emotional truth, that is where growth lives. That is where peace is real. You are no longer powerless in the presence of emotional withdrawal. You are informed. You are aware. You are grounded. And in this grounded clarity, you reclaim your emotional direction, your emotional voice, and your emotional integrity without being pulled into cycles of misunderstanding, silent distance, or unattainable connection. Thank you for allowing yourself the courage to understand, to reflect, and to rise above emotional confusion. May your journey forward be guided by clarity, self-respect, and emotional wisdom. Stay strong, stay aware, and stay true to what your heart deserves. Goodbye, and may your path always lead you toward genuine connection and authentic emotional peace.